My guest today is Leanda De Lisle, who has written the Tudors, A Family History, which I'm holding up right here. And I always begin this podcast with asking, how did the Tudors come into your sphere of interests?
Well, I studied history at Oxford University, and I always found the Stuarts and the Tudors particularly interesting period. My first two books were on, well, my first book was on the death of Elizabeth I and the accession of the first Stuart King of England, who was already King of Scotland. Then I did a book on these rivals to Queen Elizabeth I. And this made me interested in the whole Tudor succession. So I thought I'd do the history of the whole family. Most people tend to begin with kind of Henry VIII and Anne Boleyn and the Reformation, but I went right back to the very beginning of the dynasty, to Henry VII's grandfather, who was this ordinary Welsh bloke who got drunk at a party and fell into a queen's lap. And so this extraordinary story of this remarkable family and dynasty began.
It's quite like one of these coincidences. What if he never went to that party and never, how different history might have been if this never happened. But let's talk about how, because was it frowned upon that a commoner, as you described him, kind of married the queen?
Yes, it certainly was frowned on, and the fact that he was Welsh was even more frowned on. There were considered to be racial differences between the Welsh and the English, despite the fact they share an extremely small island, so that was also disapproved of. And the information was in fact kept from her son by her first marriage, who was to the King of England, who had died. She was a widow when she married this guy, Owen Tudor. And when her son, who was King Henry VI, found out, Owen Tudor was in fact at first was when he found out when his mother was dying, Owen Tudor was put in prison for marrying her without royal permission. And escaped from prison, in fact, and it was all very sort of dramatic. He was an extraordinary sort of figure, really. But eventually he reconciled with his stepson and became a very loyal subject of his stepson.
So what it was? Let's talk about quickly the War of the Roses, which eventually led into the rise of the Tudors. Of course, I believe it was the Lancasters at the time.
Yes, that's right. Yes, Henry VI was a Lancastrian, and he suffered from mental illness, which obviously sort of weakened the crown and raised the ambitions of the opposing House of York. And this really started the Wars of the Roses. Owen Tudor was a loyal supporter of Henry VI, the Lancastrian cause, and was eventually indeed, well, killed would be one way of putting it, murdered really in cold blood would be another way of putting it, which was a sort of rather nasty habit they had in the Wars of the Roses. Military commanders were captured, they were often just taken off and executed in cold blood, and that is in fact what happened to Owen Tudor. But he had already had several children by his wife, the Queen, the late Queen, who were the half brothers of the Lancastrian king, Henry VI. And they were also loyal supporters of Henry VI. And these were Tudors, of course, these young men.
Because, as you know, I believe Richard III, who is famously portrayed by Shakespeare, would take over the.
Yes, that's right. Throne. That's right. Because the House of York won. They defeated Henry VI under Edward IV. They defeated Henry VI and murdered him in the Tower. And then Edward IV, who was this sort of tall, striking, handsome figure, great warrior, looked very like and became fat as he got old, looked very like his grandson, the man who would turn out to be his grandson, the future Henry VIII. But anyway, he died young, leaving these two young boys. And the mother of these two young boys, the wife of Edward IV, tried to sort of seize control and failed. Richard III, the future Richard III, basically forced her into hiding, and the two princes, his nephews, the two children of Edward IV were put in the Tower, where they infamously disappeared, never to be seen again, aged, I think, 9 and 12 from memory.
It's quite a controversial event, that the princess in the tower. And what is your take on this? What do you think happened? Do you think they were murdered or just sent to exile, never to be seen again?
I'm quite sure they were murdered. It was the thing is that people have to look at things the way things worked at the time, rather than their fantasies about how things are now, and how the fact there's shock horror. There are no photographs of Richard III, wielding a sort of baton and bonking them on the head or anything. And the way things worked was that if one king took control and overthrew another king, king number one, i.e. the one that was overthrown, rarely lived long. But they weren't just sort of publicly murdered. So what would happen is that they would essentially be murdered, but then it would be given out that they had died of natural causes. In the case of Henry VI, for example, when he was murdered in the Tower, it was said that he had died of grief and rage. What was unusual was not that these two princes were murdered, as they surely were, but they disappeared, because what would normally have happened, it would have been said, oh, they died of plague or a head cold or grief and rage or whatever, and then their bodies would be laid out, and then all their supporters would have to accept that there was no point in fighting on, and they would then unite around the new king. The reason this didn't happen in this case was because of what had happened after the murder of Henry VI, which was that unexpectedly, the people of England had felt very sorry for poor old Henry VI, who was, as I said, mad. And so they decided that he was an innocent, which is the way they saw sort of people who were often, if you had Down syndrome, for example, in those days, they would describe you as an innocent, which meant that you were really incapable of sin. You had a sort of purity about you because you were simple. And so they sort of Henry VI this way, and they declared that he was a saint, and they would pray to him, and miracles were reported, and he became at the heart of a huge cult, which has since been forgotten because because of the Protestant Reformation. The cult of this saint king has been forgotten. But for Richard III, it was a sort of living reality, and he did not want this to happen with the princes, particularly as they were just children, and he did not want to be cast in the role of Herod. So it was simpler for the princes just to disappear. But of course, the head of their mother had to be told, because she had to sort of call off her supporters. But anyway, essentially it all backfired on Richard III and caused huge anger. And a lot of the supporters of Edward IV, the dead father of these princes, rose up against Richard III and fought with Henry VI's, half nephews, these step nephews, these Tudors, Henry Tudor, as he was then, the future Henry VII, eventually at the Battle of Bosworth, Henry Tudor, Henry VII, as he became defeated Richard III in battle, the king was killed, and Henry became Henry VII, the first Tudor king.
So let's talk about the reign of Henry VII, because it starts out quite decently. He seemed to be a decent king at first, the first half of his reign at least. Well,
none of these people were exactly sort of cozy individuals. He put this little Plantagenet. There was a Plantagenet heir still left, i.e. from the House of York. And that was another nephew of Edward IV, another nephew of Richard III's, the son of the Duke of Clarence, the Earl of Warwick. And he was put in the Tower. He was just a little boy. He was put in the Tower like the other princes before him. He wasn't murdered. I think that obviously hadn't gone well for Richard III, so this little boy wasn't murdered, at least not for a long time. But he grew up, and Henry VII was facing problems from pretenders who were pretending to be one of the lost princes in the Tower, because Henry VII's enemies needed someone to rally around, and so they sort of just produced some sort of random boy from Europe and claimed he was the younger of the princes in the Tower, a man called Lambert Simnel. And eventually he was captured, put in the Tower with the genuine Plantagenet nephew. Henry VII at this stage wanted to marry his own son, the elder son, Arthur, to the daughter, Catherine of Aragon, of the dual monarchs of Spain. And the Spanish were saying, oh, we don't know if we want to marry our daughter to Arthur, because how secure are you on the throne when there's this heir, this Plantagenet heir still alive? And so what Henry VII did is he got a sort of fake escape attempt done, and used this as an excuse to execute both Lambert Simnel and this innocent Plantagenet young man who had been in the Tower since childhood. And the story became later, interestingly, that this cursed the Tudor line. At this stage, he had two sons. He had Arthur, he had Henry. And it was said that the curse was that they would never have any more male heirs that grew to adulthood. And of course, Arthur died shortly after he married Catherine of Aragon. And I think Henry VII was very worried about this being seen as a punishment from God for what he had done in executing this Plantagenet boy.
We have to remember that people were very superstitious back then. That this, even though it sounds silly today, people were suspicious and took this quite serious. This curses quite seriously.
Oh yes, they took it very seriously, and in a way it reflected a reality, which is that people were genuinely horrified that this Plantagenet boy had been executed, essentially an act of judicial murder. It hadn't gone unnoticed. People thought, why had this boy been executed like this? And superstitious or not, people even now, they expect some form of justice. And if you can't get it through the courts, people think about fate or karma or whatever. So it was interesting that it was at this stage that all these stories came out about how Richard III had supposedly ordered the murder of the princes in the Tower, because I think he wanted to deflect attention from his own actions and his own involvement in the death of this other little prince in the Tower, which no one or few people now remember. But who has descendants who some people think of as the rightful King of England even now.
Something I want to go back to and ask, when Henry VII took the throne, did he have the right to the throne, or was it looked on as an usurper to the throne?
I'm sorry, can I just go back a bit? I was quite wrong there. I just want to say, no, this boy, the Earl of Warwick, does not have descendants. The current descendants are from his sister. Sorry, I just wanted to correct
That's fine.
A wrong statement I'd made. So what was your question?
Yeah, of course. So, I want to go back as well a wee bit, because, as Henry VII took the throne, I forgot to ask this, and was he looked at an usurper to the throne, or did he have the right to the throne by his father?
No, he had no right to the throne. His mother was from the house of Lancaster, but he had royal blood, but it was illegitimate, and through his mother came from an illegitimate line. So no, he had no blood right to the throne, really, but he had the right of conquest. Which is, people forget, royal rights comes in different ways. He had the right of conquest. He had defeated Richard III. But what he did, so a lot of people say, oh, he murdered the princes in the Tower because I don't know why, because he had no right, and he was worried about their right or whatever. But actually, he never claimed the throne in right of his wife, because he married the sister of the princes in the Tower. That is a misunderstanding. He married the sister of the princess in the Tower, certainly because he wanted the House of York, the supporters of the House of York, to support him. He did not marry her to use her blood to claim the throne, or because obviously if she died, he would have no rights. So he said that God had chosen him, and that Henry VI, who, don't forget, everyone believed was, well, many people in England believed was a saint, and whose cult he encouraged, that Henry VI had predicted his reign, had foretold it, had been prophesied. And so essentially he had been chosen by God. He was also confirmed as king by Parliament. And one thing people don't really understand is that in England, and indeed the monarchs themselves didn't really, certainly didn't like to advertise the fact, but actually kings and indeed queens of England have essentially been parliamentary appointees since at least this time, and perhaps even back to the reign of Edward IV, because Parliament, would say, yes, this is our king, which they did with Henry VII. So he was king by right of Parliament, by right of conquest, and he would say that God had chosen him.
So he wasn't like usurping the throne.
Well, he was usurping the throne, but he had lots of excuses for it.
Yeah.
He managed to,
that's fair.
afterwards justify it.
Yeah, that's fair. But let's talk about his marriage, because he was genuinely in love, and it was heartbreaking for him when his wife did die during, as I said, about half of his reign. He was quite in love with her, from what I remember.
Yes, I think he was in love with her. I think, he had a very hard life. He was, Edward IV tried to kill him when he was only a boy of sort of 13. He had to leave Britain and flee to Europe, and had a long and lonely existence before his marriage in his late 20s. And the beginning of that marriage must have been quite tricky, but for many reasons. But she was very beautiful. Not Elizabeth Woodville. Elizabeth Woodville was his mother-in-law. I'm sorry, Elizabeth of York. She was very beautiful, and probably very intelligent. Both her parents certainly were. And yes, he certainly did love her, and was devastated when she died in childbirth. And she died in childbirth because she tried to have another baby after Arthur died, and she became pregnant, and she died in childbirth, and the child died too.
And that's quite where it started to go downhill for the reign of Henry VII, isn't it?
Yes, I think that, yes, I mean, but I suppose he had this other boy, the future Henry VIII, to raise up. But yes, he became very ill, and predeceased his mother, in fact, and died. But yeah, well, I don't know if he had a lot of problems in his reign, because he had to face several rebellions, but the end, he said he became more unpopular, began raising more taxes. He was not liked. He was disliked. He was not a popular king.
And we have to remember as well, I believe the War of the Roses wasn't over just because he gained the throne. It went on for quite some time after Henry VII.
Yes, absolutely. They were the heirs of the House of York, various more distant heirs than the one he'd had executed. Yes, they did, and they went on, in fact, having attempts on the throne well into the reign of Henry VIII, until they were finally defeated in the 1520s, from memory.
So let's talk about the takeover, because of Henry VIII. They are settled in the elephant Tudor in the room. So let's talk about what everyone mostly probably know from the Tudor dynasty. That he is arguably the most famous king from there. So he was quite cruel king, wasn't it?
Yes, Henry VIII. I think he was very like his grandfather, Edward IV, as I said. So when he was young, he was incredibly popular, because he was everything a king was supposed to be. He was not a usurper. He did have royal blood. He was, through his mother, he had all this, and looked very like Edward IV. He was very good looking. He was very athletic. He was very charming. He was very convivial. He was very musical. He was everything that a king was supposed to be. He seemed when he was young. He was incredible. He wanted to be a great king. He admired, he greatly, Henry V and the stories of the 100 Years' War, and he wanted to reconquer France, which had been lost by Henry VI. and become a great king through conquest, at which he sort of failed utterly, it has to be said. But he went on trying right up to the end, pretty much, well into the 1540s.
Let's talk about the education of Henry VIII, because it was the typical royal education, and it wasn't. I wouldn't say it was, as it explained, simply. It was kind of intelligent, I would say.
Oh yes, he was certainly highly intelligent and educated. Yes, no, he was. He, yeah, no, he was not a stupid man at all. Far from it.
Because it was you had to learn quite a lot when you were trying to be continuous. The Latin was a common kind of what English is today, I suppose, when you communicate with other royal courts. That Latin was the language they used, so he had to learn Latin. If I remember correctly, like you mentioned, he was fascinated by history and he wanted to learn history.
Yes, and well, don't forget his father was more comfortable speaking French than English, having spent most of his life in France. Yes, absolutely. And he was a good picker of men. I mean, he knew he was a good picker of men. And I mean, in choosing Wolsey, for example, as his leading minister, who was a brilliant administrator. He, did well there. He was a good picker of men, and ruthless when he needed to be ruthless, utterly ruthless, as time would show.
Let's talk about his accession to the throne, and when after his father's death, and his first marriage, of course, which will be the first of many marriages.
Yes, to Catherine of Aragon. Yes, again, he wanted an alliance. He wanted a military alliance against France. That's why he married Catherine of Aragon. But he loved her genuinely, and was very happy with her for a time. But of course, the fact that she did have a son, but she didn't have any sons who lived to adulthood, was dangerous. It weakened him, and he was very aware of that. And he was also a very arrogant man, and he wanted to, he could have married his daughter Mary to somebody, difficult to know who, though, because then they may have become a dangerous rival. And as he said once, he wanted to have a son as like other men. He wanted to have a male. He wanted to have a male heir, and he was determined to get one way or another.
Does this come back again to the curse that supposedly was given to over the Tudor reign?
Because there was another royal cousin of his, the Duke of Buckingham, who was very interested in this curse, and Henry didn't trust him and heard that the Duke of Buckingham had been sort of talking about this curse with people and had him executed. So that was, yes. So I'm sure Henry was aware, but he didn't believe it. He decided that the curse was that he had married the wrong wife. Unfortunately, he chose the wrong argument at the wrong time. There would have been other ways he could have got his divorce, or not in divorce, because he never believed in divorce. It was his marriages were his divorces were annulments. He never had a divorce. He disapproved of divorce till the day he died. So actually, it's wrong to describe it as divorce. But he wanted his marriage to Catherine of Aragon annulled. And when the Catholic Church wouldn't give it to him in the way that he wanted it, he essentially broke away and nationalized the Catholic Church. He was not a Protestant. This is a misunderstanding. And indeed, he burned Protestants, sort of proto-Protestants at the stake till the day he died, pretty much. But he made himself Pope in England, basically, is what he did. Get his annulment.
Yeah, let's talk about the divorce or annulment. Let's say from the Pope and the Catholic line, because the forming of the Church of England under Henry VIII's reign.
Yes. Well, it was being reformed anyway, because this was a time when reform was coming, and indeed the Council of Trent began. The first meeting of the Council of Trent was in the 1540s, when Henry VIII was still on the throne. That took many decades, but would lead to reforms in the Catholic Church and eventually the Counter-Reformation. But yes, so yeah, exactly. So he was leading various reforms, but he was a conservative, so he still believed in the Catholic Mass. As I said, very against divorce. And interestingly, the Church of England, even when it did become Protestant, did not allow divorce until about 20 years ago, which is, I think, pretty much unique amongst Protestant churches. And in many ways, it was easier to get an annulment in the Catholic Church than to remarry in the Church of England, which was a sort of slightly weird situation down the centuries, but that is the way things panned out. He never liked Luther, and indeed, eventually, the Church of England, when it became Protestant in the reign of his son, really they were followers of, they were Reformed Protestants, which, you know, like John Calvin, not Lutherans. But anyway, that's another story. But Henry VIII, yes, so they got rid of all the monasteries, partly started with the reform of the monasteries, which, you know, which had always happened, but then they just got rid of them all. And Henry, all the land was essentially made royal land, or he bought off his supporters. So all the church, not all the church land, but the most church land ended up in either the king's pocket or in the pocket of leading nobles.
Someone we forgot to mention, and this will become important later, of course, is that he had a daughter by Catherine of Aragon, which would be Mary the First.
Yeah, Mary the First, yes.
So let's talk about international relations, because he do meet quite some great kings and emperors of the era, among them Francis, and they do try to form international relations among them, like you said, Charles V and of course Francis I of France.
Yes, I mean, it was interesting. I mean, Henry VIII was wanted to protect when he had, because, you know, he had Mary, and then when he married Anne Boleyn, he had another daughter, the future Elizabeth I, and then finally, he had, through his third wife Jane Seymour, he had Edward VI, the future Edward the Sixth. And so when after this little boy was born, he was determined to protect him, and he was very aware of what had happened to the princes in the Tower, of course. And so he didn't want any powerful royal. So he kept both his daughters as spinsters, unmarried. He also kept them illegitimate. In the 1540s, as he was old and he realized he wasn't going to live forever, he put them back in line of succession after his son, but interestingly kept them illegitimate. And I think this is because he wanted them weak. He didn't want any strong heirs. He didn't want anybody who might do a Richard III, basically, on his son Edward. So these girls, these two princesses, were kept as spinsters. They were kept illegitimate, having been made illegitimate after his marriages to their mothers were annulled. And he then also downgraded the Stuart line of his sister, Margaret of Scotland, who had married the King of Scots, so that they were put below the line of his English sister, who only had daughters and granddaughters. So, because he wanted them weak, he wanted just weak female heirs. He didn't want any male heirs or to his own son. No threat. And ironically, when he died, power was seized by the non-royal nephews, rather as the Woodvilles had tried to seize power on the death of Edward IV. So on the death of Henry VIII, Edward VI's non-royal uncles took power.
So, but let's talk about the when they meet, because it does seem to get quite well along with Charles V, and unlike Francis I of England, France, not England, but which their relationship kind of doesn't go well, because as I remember reading on Francis I's biography, he does beat Henry VIII in a wrestling match, and is kind of insulted by that.
You have to remember that in England, I think because of the Armada, people remember this Anglo-Spanish rivalry, but in fact, the great rivalry was not at this time between England and Spain, but between England and France historically, because of the 100 Years' War. That was the great rivalry. So naturally, Henry would have looked to other powers to help him against France. France was the great rival. France was the great enemy. People forget.
So, but he does, like you said, he does go along quite well with Charles V. They seem to have a decent relationship, and there is a new book covering this, as I got told of, that I'm glad to read it eventually, but where they cover the relationship with Henry VIII and Charles V.
Ah, yes. Well, I mean, absolutely. And he, yes, for a time, but of course, after with the divorce, with the annulment of his marriage to Catherine of Aragon, that the relationship didn't go so well at that point.
So you mentioned Anne Boleyn. Before we move on, I want to talk, of course, about her, because she's arguably one of the most famous to Henry VIII's wife. She has several books written about her, and she's arguably, if people talk about Henry VIII, they probably don't mention Anne Boleyn, because she is, like I said, she is the most one, but probably comes first to mind of people when they think about Henry VIII's wives.
Yeah. Yes, she was a fascinating woman, Anne Boleyn, a tragic figure, really, trapped into this marriage with Henry VIII. I think she'd probably much rather have been married to a great aristocrat like Northumberland, and then proved, as unable to produce failed to produce a son, just as Catherine of Aragon did. But in her case, of course, she wasn't royal, and she was just a British subject. Sorry, an English subject. There was no British subject in those days. She was a subject of, and she was an English subject, and quite relatively easy to dispose of. Still shocking, though, that they chopped off the head of a queen.
And she would, of course, be the mother, like you said, of Elizabeth I.
Yes, absolutely. She was the mother of Elizabeth I. And so, although she was condemned very much in her lifetime, was very unpopular in her lifetime, she is perceived differently through the prism of the reign of her great daughter Elizabeth.
So we have to move on, of course, and we have to talk about the end of Henry VIII's reign, because he did get quite big at the end of his reign, and how did the succession go from his one and only son? Because he was quite young at the time of Henry VIII's death.
He was 9. Well, essentially, the power was seized by his uncle, who made himself Duke of Somerset, and he introduced, and indeed imposed, reformed Protestantism on England, which was a very conservative country religiously. There was a major rebellion, the so-called Prayer Book Rebellion, which was crushed. They brought in foreign mercenaries to do it, Italians and Germans. But then, when he was only 15, it became evident that he was dying, probably of tuberculosis. And the people who were then running the show were confronted with the fact that Edward's heir was his Catholic half-sister, Mary Tudor, and they needed to try and prevent this. And so Edward was persuaded, because it seems unlikely to come entirely out of his own head, to bequeath the throne to his cousin, to a very junior cousin called Lady Jane Grey. He excluded Elizabeth as well as Mary, because the pretext for excluding Mary was that she was illegitimate. And Elizabeth Tudor, although Protestant, was also illegitimate. So they were both excluded, and the throne was left to Lady Jane Grey, who was married off to Guildford Dudley, because they couldn't really conceive of a queen ruling on her own. Guildford Dudley, who was the son of the Duke of Northumberland, would probably have, if things had gone on long enough, would have been king.
But it wouldn't go like that, of course.
No, because Mary Tudor was a very remarkable woman. She had had as her governess the last Plantagenet, who was a woman, who the Countess of Salisbury, who ran her own estates as a man would. Her mother, of course, was the daughter of Isabel of Castile, great warrior queen of Spain, and Mary Tudor was extremely remarkable. So on the death of Edward VI and the accession of Lady Jane Grey, or Lady Jane Dudley, as she was in fact, as Queen Jane, the imperial ambassadors wrote her off and said, oh, it's all hopeless, nothing we can do. We just have to accept things. But Mary Tudor had rather more balls than the imperial ambassador. And she raised an army against Queen Jane. And in fact, her defeat of Queen Jane and her supporters was the, I think, only example of the entire Tudor period of somebody defeating the central power, which is what she did. And she had popular support for this and became queen.
But that, like you said earlier, she was illegitimized by Henry VIII because of the annulment of Catherine. So how did she justify being illegitimate?
It had always been very dubious, because she was in law, in church law at this time, and if your parents had genuinely believed that they had a right to marry when they married, even if your marriage was subsequently annulled, the children were remained legitimate. So she had been made illegitimate, and Henry had used an act of parliament to do it, but it never really had any basis in canon law. And so she was able to reverse this, and Parliament lifted the illegitimacy. So this illegitimate slur was removed. Interestingly, Elizabeth I never dared do that, because her circumstances were very different. Her parents' marriage was annulled before Anne Boleyn was executed. We don't know the grounds, but we suspect it was that Henry had admitted that he had had an affair with Mary Boleyn, Anne Boleyn's sister, before they married, and that this would have made the marriage illegitimate. And as he knew this perfectly well when he married Anne, and indeed Anne knew it perfectly well, this meant that Elizabeth was legitimate in both canon law and state law, and it was never reversed by Parliament, interestingly, something that's not well known. But anyway, in Mary's case, it was lifted.
So let's talk about her reign, because this was quite brutal, and unlike during Henry VIII's reign, Protestantism has now had its root in England, if I remember correctly. So
absolutely.
Instead of persecuting Protestants, she persecuted now Catholics.
No, the other way around. Yes.
Right.
Yeah, the other way around. So Henry actually persecuted both Catholics and Protestants. He persecuted Catholics who were loyal to the Pope, and he executed Protestants for heresy. And so he had them burned at the stake as heretics. Mary revived her father's heresy laws and burned something like 300 Protestants at the stake, greater than any monarch in Europe, more savage. In Europe, they actually did kill much larger numbers, but they didn't tend to actually use the law courts to do it. They were just sort of massacres and so forth. So in England, there weren't massacres, but instead she used the courts to burn these people at the stake, and it was incredibly brutal. It might have succeeded, however, because even 300 are relatively small numbers, and Protestantism hadn't really taken root. Yes, there were Protestants in England, but it still wasn't yet a Protestant country. Don't forget, Protestantism had only come in a few years earlier, a handful of years earlier, and there had been this massive rebellion against it also during this period of a handful of years between basically the 1550s. So and the 1540s, and so it might have succeeded, but she didn't have children. So it was these deaths, these horrible, terrible deaths, achieved nothing but infamy. And Elizabeth I became queen on her death, on Mary's death.
And of course, all this persecution is how we got the famous drink Bloody Mary, I believe.
Yes, that was a term that was, I think, started to be used in the 18th century. And it's worth remembering. I mean, bloody she certainly was, and she certainly to take personal responsibility for those deaths. But it's worth bearing in mind as well that there had been a rebellion against Mary, where she executed very few people. Elizabeth, in her early years, there was a rebellion against her. I think 900 people were executed. So Elizabeth was also quite brutal, and would also, interestingly, burn heretics at the stake, something that's not well known. But heretics for her were defined much more narrowly as as extreme Protestants, of whom there were very few in England. So there's only a handful of people burned.
Now, before we go on to Elizabeth I, I want to talk about Mary Tudor's marriage to Philip II, son of Charles V. Just briefly talk, because he didn't love her, but it was quite sad when she passed away.
I think he said he was moderately sad. I don't think he was terribly sad. She was older. She was ill. She probably wasn't very attractive. She couldn't have children. I think he respected her. I think he respected her, and she was a figure to respect. But he didn't love her. No, I mean, it's hardly surprising.
What were they hoping to gain by this alliance, by this marriage alliance with Philip II and Mary Tudor?
She wanted a powerful ally. I mean, it's normal to have, she wanted to have a powerful ally for England against Spain, against France. I mean, they were fighting France again during her reign. But I mean, God knows what would have happened if they had children. That's quite a sort of interesting thought, really. I wonder if the Spanish Netherlands would have I wonder if they'd had more than one child, like you had the way that the Habsburgs broke up. Charles V, part went to one child, another went to another child, and you had Spain and the Netherlands and bits of Italy and one bit of the Habsburgs, and you had the Holy Roman Empire and another bit. What would have happened if they had children? And I sort of suspect there would have been one of their children would have probably been given England and the Netherlands, I suspect. Who knows?
So of course we are from the last Tudor, which is Elizabeth I, as we talked about. But during her childhood, she would seem to be kind of tucked away. She didn't have much public appearances, or in the Mary I reign. She did fear, if I remember correctly, she did kind of fear for her life as well during Mary I's reign. What would happen to her?
Yes, well, the thing is, after Jane Grey was overthrown and indeed later executed, Elizabeth posed a threat to Mary. Mary was well aware that many of Elizabeth's supporters had supported Jane, and had tried to exclude her from the throne. There were attempts on Mary's life. There was an invasion attempt, and so she understandably did not trust Elizabeth. And I'm sure she would have excluded her from the succession if she could have done, but she knew she couldn't really. There was nobody, I don't think, that the English people would have accepted. They wanted a daughter of Henry VIII. She had support as a daughter of Henry VIII. Elizabeth was also a daughter of Henry VIII. And so there was nothing she could do about that. She could have had her murdered in the Tower. I mean, we sort of think I think her male ancestors would have done that, and I bet you Elizabeth would have done that. And Elizabeth indeed later tried to do exactly that with her heir, Mary, Queen of Scots. Mary, Queen of Scots was in the Tower. She ordered her servants to murder Mary. They refused to do so. I'm sure they would have done so if she'd been Henry VIII. It's interesting again because she was a queen and not a king. They refused to do so. They insisted on having Mary, Queen of Scots tried, which Elizabeth did not want. She did not want a monarch put on trial. She wanted her murdered. And so it's interesting. So Mary could have had Elizabeth murdered, did not. Mary's male ancestors almost certainly would have had Elizabeth murdered. And Elizabeth herself, if she could have done, I'm sure would have had Mary Tudor murdered if their positions had been reversed. So, I mean, it's something that's only just struck me now since we're talking. It is interesting. Mary Tudor, given what was at stake, everything was at stake, particularly for her religion, of course, with her faith, what was going to happen, that she did not have Elizabeth murdered. Interesting.
It's one of those one of those what if of history, how different it would have been. Would Mary Queen of Scots have taken over after Mary, or what would have happened with the legitimization of the throne? Would we have another civil war? Because she had no successor.
Yes, the fear of civil war was tremendous in England as well, because people had not forgotten the horrors of the Wars of the Roses, and that hung like a great shadow in England in a way that is difficult for us to remember and really understand now.
So let's talk about Elizabeth I's accession to the throne, and of course we have one of the biggest, most famous is that she was the Virgin Queen, which we are driving to talk about, and of course you mentioned her rivalry with Mary, Queen of Scots.
Yes, although people know about the rivalry with Mary, Queen of Scots, what they're not so aware of her rivalry with her Protestant heirs, because she is seen as the great goddess of English Protestant nationalism. But this is a sort of myth. So her heir-in-law, Elizabeth I, became queen because she had been made Mary's successor by statute during the reign of Henry VIII. Being illegitimate, she had no right in common law. She had the right of Parliament. Parliament had given her the right. Statute had given her the right. She had no other right. And the same statute that made her Mary's heir made Lady Jane Dudley, Lady Jane Grey's sisters, her heirs. And these were Protestants, Lady Catherine Grey and Lady Mary Grey, who I write about extensively in my book and are usually ignored. So in the 1560s, and the first decade of Elizabeth's reign, her chief rival was not the Catholic Mary Queen of Scots. It was the Protestant Lady Catherine Grey, who she did her best to destroy and indeed imprisoned, and made this, when this girl married to an entirely respectable Protestant aristocrat, made her children illegitimate, and she eventually died in custody. The same fate awaited the youngest sister, Lady Mary Grey, who never had children but was also imprisoned after her marriage. Elizabeth was determined to prevent their marriage. And actually it's an extremely important part of Elizabeth's reign, and one that's not well known because it doesn't fit in with English national myths. So they're ignored and their history is conveniently forgotten.
The Dudley, I want to talk about the Dudleys for a while, not Harry Potter family, but the Dudleys under the Tudor reign, because they do have an excellent biography of them written recently. They tried to win power behind the throne, weren't they?
Well, they certainly were during the reign of Edward VI, and the sons of of John Dudley, Duke of Northumberland, the younger one of his younger ones, married Lady Jane Grey, and was executed as she was by Mary Tudor. And then, of course, famously, Robert Dudley was Elizabeth I's great love. She couldn't marry him. and because the Dudleys were incredibly unpopular, and she would have been overthrown if she had. And he was, when she became queen, he was married to somebody else. And when the girl died, he was assumed to have had her murdered. Anyway, so Elizabeth couldn't marry him, much as she wanted to. So he was very powerful. I certainly wouldn't say he was the power behind the throne, but he was a very influential figure because she loved him.
So something I want to know, as you mentioned, that she was the Virgin Queen, and that's probably again what comes through people's mind when they hear Elizabeth I, that she was the Virgin Queen. But should she and though this was two different, I want the little comparison here, because as Catherine the Great in Russia, though it was two different centuries and different cultures, she took quite a few lovers on the bedside. Should Elizabeth have done the same, or would that have been frowned upon as?
It certainly would have been frowned upon, and she didn't do it. And I suspect she was a virgin until she died. And there are all sorts of unpleasant rumors that put about by men, needless to say, but taken up sometimes by women, that she was a virgin because she was physically deformed in some way and couldn't have sex. It was even said that she was really basically a man. And people were saying this in the 1980s. It was quite extraordinary because they said she had masculine qualities, because of course women are supposed to be so useless and stupid that they can't make good rulers. So she must actually have been a genetic male. It was so ridiculous, one can barely be bothered to engage with it. But yes, you have to remember she was surrounded by people all the time. She was never alone. So it would have been extremely difficult for her to have had sex. And if she had, there was, of course, the risk of pregnancy. Her mother had been executed. Jane Grey, her cousin, had been executed. She lived, poor Elizabeth, I have to say, she was an incredible woman, but she lived in fear of her life every day. And she was a survivor. I mean, she really was. The fact that she survived to live and reign as long as she did was a remarkable and extraordinary achievement as a woman on her own. But she realized that being a woman on her own was marginally less dangerous than being attached to a man. She'd seen what had happened to Jane Grey, who had married a Dudley, who people hadn't approved of. She had seen what happened to her sister Mary Tudor, who his marriage to Philip of Spain had triggered a rebellion. Who should she marry? Who would it have been safe for her to marry? No one.
So, and the moment when you talk about this, and it kind of makes sense as well, you write about her in the book, she does seem a bit paranoid as well, and you can understand why, with all these things going on in her life, and she has fears every day.
In a way, yes. I don't know if she was paranoid. I mean, I think, she had every reason to be wary, to be awake to the reality of the dangers with which she was constantly surrounded.
So let's talk about, you mentioned briefly, but let's talk a little more before we go to the end of the Tudors about the rivalry. Speak a little more about the rivalry with Mary Queen of Scots. So he's had infamously a movie in 2018 starring Margot Robbie, of course. But so let's talk about the rivalry with Elizabeth I and Mary Queen of Scots.
Yes, I think Elizabeth would have loved them to have been friends. I think she was fascinated by this woman who, like her, was a reigning monarch, not just a queen consort, but a reigning monarch. But it was just impossible, really, because soon Elizabeth never named her heir. And because she spoke once about the rising sun, how the danger of the people worship the rising rather than the setting sun. So if you're a sitting monarch, your heir is the rising sun. And certainly if you show any signs of illness or weakness, you're the setting sun. And the reason that she detested Lady Catherine Grey so much in the 1660s is that she was an unmarried queen with no children, and this girl, her heir-in-law, was married and had one, then two sons. Very dangerous until she destroyed her. Mary Queen of Scots, similarly, who was imprisoned in England months after the death of Lady Catherine Grey, was married and had a son who's King of Scots, of course, and so posed a threat as potentially as the rising sun. So, or her hopes of friendship with Mary, Queen of Scots, which existed really before Mary had married or had a son, and certainly came to an end, just was destroyed by fear. Just destroyed by fear. I mean, they could easily have met, because after all, she was living. Mary, Queen of Scots, was living in England, being imprisoned by her, but she never did meet her. What she must have wondered what would have been achieved by it.
So let's talk about the end of Elizabeth I and what made her son James, which of course was named James. Just, can you really be named James if you are anything else than James, if you are Scottish king? So, so let's talk about his accession to the throne and the end of the Tudor dynasty.
Yes. Well, I wrote a book about this called After Elizabeth, because I think a lot of people assume that it was just sort of, Elizabeth died and then her male heir, in blood, James Stuart, King of Scots, became king. But actually, this was much more complex than people realize, because, as I said, he was not her heir in law. Lady Catherine Grey's heirs would have been, but of course that was complicated by this time, because Elizabeth had made Catherine Grey's sons illegitimate. So that was complicated, and she had weakened them in various ways. But there were other potential heirs, I think a dozen at least. But James was eventually chosen essentially by Robert Cecil, Elizabeth's leading minister, and a sort of cabal of Elizabeth's ministers were in touch with James, and they sort of stitched things up. The others were all quite weakened at this time, and they enabled, although it was very, very dodgy, and people were very worried there was going to be a civil war that was going to break out on Elizabeth's death, but they managed to pull it together, and James succeeded to the throne in 1603.
And that would be, of course, the end of the Tudor dynasty, and I think we're gonna round it up there. Before you go, do you have anything you want to promote? Any social media where people might find you, or anything you want me to put in the description?
I have a website, leandadelisle.com, LeandaDelisle, which has all my various Tudor and Stuart books on it. I am also on Twitter at Leanda De Lisle. My latest book is actually on Henrietta Maria, the wife of Charles I, and it's a revisionary biography of a great woman who is probably Britain's most maligned queen consort, because she was actually Queen of England and of Scots.
Sounds fascinating. I'm definitely looking forward to read that one. Thank you so much for coming on to talk about the podcast, about the Tudor dynasty on the podcast. So my name is Alan. This has been Well That Aged Well. You can find us on YouTube, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, wherever people can find podcasts this day. If you're on iTunes, please consider writing a little review. That would help us out a lot. Also, please like, share, and subscribe. And I'll see you next time.